Good afternoon, distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends. Welcome to this event jointly organized by the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences, the Contemporary China Research Cluster, and the Sociology Department at the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Hong Kong. My name is John Wong. I work here at the Institute, and I'm a convener of our research cluster called Delta on the Move, an effort of ours that looks at the making of the region we now know as the Greater Bay Area. I am honored to introduce to you our speaker today, Professor Xueguang Zhou of Stanford University. In keeping with his wide-ranging impact of his scholarship, Professor Zhou holds many titles at Stanford. He is the Gortingly Professor in Economic Development. He is a Professor of Sociology and is a Senior Fellow at the Freeman Sparkley Institute for International Studies. Professor Zhou has held many appointments in addition to his work at Stanford. He's currently a distinguished visiting professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He has taught at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. And beyond Hong Kong, he has had titles with Fudan and Tsinghua, and in Europe, INSEAD. In addition to Stanford, he has taught at Duke and Cornell, so wide-ranging portfolio. His research focuses on institutional changes in contemporary China, Chinese society, and his emphasis is on Chinese organizations and management, social inequality, and state-society relationships. He is published widely in top journals, both Chinese and English, and widely cited. His book, published by Cambridge University Press, The State and Life Chances in Urban China, Redistribution and Stratification, 1949 to 1994, received the Best Book Award from the American Sociology Association. The title of his talk today is Between Hierarchy and Patriarchy, the Duality of Chinese Bureaucracy and History. He's going to give us his lecture, to be followed by a Q&A session moderated by our colleague in sociology, Professor Eric Fong. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Zhou.
Thank you, Professor Wang, for this wonderful introduction, and thank you all for being here. It is my honor to present my work here and communicate with my colleagues and some old friends, and also I hope I will meet some new friends today. And also I welcome your comments on this the project that I'm going to present. Okay. So let me start with a few words about the motivation of this project. For the last decades also, I have been working on local government relationships, interactions with the populace in China in the rural areas. What I found in my field work, actually, when I reflect on what is going on in the Chinese history, as I read historical research, I realized there are many recurrent themes from present, what's going on in China in the rural areas, and what happened in history. So that got my curiosity about historical patterns of Chinese governance. So I realized actually there are two types of path dependency. The first one is what we are familiar with. That is, path dependency means there's some continuity between the past and the present. So by examining what is going on in the past, we can better understand what is going on today. But there is a second kind of path dependency. That is, even when we observe historical discontinuity, so-called historical turning points, these turning points actually may be a reaction to what happened in the past, to the historical legacies we had before. So these two kind of path dependencies actually form the kind of curiosities I have and I want to present today. That is the historical origins of state-making in China. And I want to just start by making an interesting observation about so-called the bureaucratic phenomena in China and around the world. The bureaucracy we know today actually has not been there forever. The German sociologist Max Weber actually first noted this phenomenon. Actually, he coined this word bureaucracy at the beginning of the 20th century, where he noticed that a new form of organizations arose at that time, and with the characteristics of hierarchies, and conduct their daily business, routine business based on rules and written documents, and the employees are professional trained and they have a professional career within the organizations. And that's what he called the bureaucratic organizations. And he argues that there are two driving forces behind bureaucratic organizations. The first one is what he called the competition that leads to the rise of modern states. That is starting in the 17th century and on, when European states compete for taxation, competing for management of public affairs, and also, of course, military organizations. And they realized that bureaucratic organizations, starting with the Prussian army, was the most effective way of mobilization. And so they adopted that new organizational form. The second driving force was the so-called the rise of the capitalist economy, where there's demand for efficiency, predictability, and promptness. And again, bureaucratic organizations match these demands in a much more effective way. However, if we look back to the Chinese history, we realize that actually the Chinese bureaucracy actually existed more than 2,000 years before Max Weber coined the term of bureaucracy. Historian Li Feng at Columbia University published his book on the 西周国家, 中国的西周国家. And he argues that actually he demonstrated using archaeological evidence that the bureaucracy of the Xizhou governance at that time showed remarkable, or almost point by point, parallel with the Weberian bureaucracy. Okay, so you can look at this book to find his specific argument, also systematic evidence. And Japanese scholar Fu Guzhi, he studied the written communication in Xi Han. And he demonstrated that by Xi Han, the written communication in the Chinese bureaucracy had already fully matured. Actually, he would argue it's over matured. And he argued that actually led to the demise of the Xi Han government. So this is really interesting question. How do we compare and interpret these two organizational forms? They're very similar in formality, but 2,000 years apart. And this is actually the theme what I want to argue today. That is the historical evolutions between the Chinese bureaucracy and the modern states in Europe shared many similarities in formality, but actually there are major differences in substance. And these two organizations experience actually two distinct paths of historical evolution. And the Chinese bureaucracy is a characteristic of the theme of today's talk, the duality of hierarchy and patriarchy. That is to say, the Chinese bureaucracy is a mixture of these two organizational forms. One is the hierarchy, the central feature of bureaucracy, but also patriarchy, the central feature of the Chinese culture, especially Confucian culture. And this duality has become an important historical legacy, I argue, that shaped the trajectory of state-making even in contemporary China. And that's relevant to sociologists like me. So let me just quickly outline what I'm going to discuss as follows. I already outlined the issues I want to discuss. I want to approach this in three aspects. The first one is I want to set up a comparative framework to discuss comparing the trajectories in China and in Europe. And then I want to focus on the historical trend of change in the Chinese history in terms of the duality of Chinese bureaucracy, and some kind of evidence drawing on secondary literature from the historians' research. And I want to just end briefly with a theoretical specification, exploration about the possible mechanisms that lead to this duality paradigm, and I will end with some discussions about the implications. So let me start with this comparative institutional analysis. We can set up these two organizational forms, two ideal types, the kinship and the bureaucracy. And the kinship, in English, there's also other terms like clans, patriarchy, as the central authority features. It tends to be based on blood ties in the form of extended families, sometimes involving multiple generations. And the central feature and the core of this kinship tend to be patriarchal relationships with a differential mode of association, which I'm going to discuss later. Because early tribal societies were almost always associated with kinship relationships, so kinship is often argued as the natural order of the civilization in the early days. Now, in contrast, bureaucracy, as I said before, is a modern, contemporary version of the new form of organizations. Structurally, it is hierarchical and functionally differentiated. It is based on formal rules and written documentation. And as Weber pointed out, the employees, the officials within the bureaucracy, tend to be professionally trained and have their professional careers within the organizations. And in contemporary society, bureaucratic form of organizations are everywhere, in governments, schools, companies, hospitals, and so on and so forth. So we can put these two ideal types side by side and realize that really these two ideal types are contrasting form of organizations in terms of their structural characteristics, in terms of their social role differentiation, in terms of the kind of legitimacy, basics of legitimacy between the traditional kinship organizations versus the bureaucratic form of organizations. So the question is, what is the relationship between these two forms of organizations? According to the modernization theory of the half century ago, societies evolved from a traditional form of organizations, kinship, into the bureaucratic form of organizations. Or is it? Sometimes we do observe the coexistence of these two forms in contemporary society and side by side sometimes within the same organizations. And that's what I'm going to argue. That is, if we look at historically how these two organizations evolved over time between Europe and China, that actually give us some clues how these two forms of organizations evolved. So let's start with historian Creel's observations when he argued that the feudal system in Europe and in China, they shared many similarities. But as he argued, in one respect of fundamental importance, the two systems differed sharply. The peoples among whom European feudalism chiefly developed did not have large lineages acknowledging a common ancestry or unambiguously loyalties based on kinship. But all these features are central to the Chinese culture and Chinese social institutions. And other scholars recognize the same patterns. For example, anthropologist Robert Bellah, he noted that modern Western society, which has grown out of a traditional Christian civilization, is based on less exclusively on the family than any other known society. But in contrast, China, of all great civilizations, made the family the most central. And economic historian Grief offered a different interpretation, but pretty much pointing to the same patterns. He argued that the church in Europe actually fought for land ownership from their despots. And that's why they actively participated in the making of the marriage and family institutions in the medieval Europe. And that's why since medieval Europe, the nuclear family became the dominant form of family, whereas the kinship declined over time. And sociologist Xueguang, who is a professor at Shanghai University, have published a series of articles focusing on the contemporary image of families in social institutions in China. And he argued, which I found a key point here, that family is a fundamental metaphor in the Chinese culture. And he demonstrated this in different aspects. So if we contrast the kinship between Europe and China, and sociologist Gary Hamilton, I think, made the most interesting comparison. So I want to just discuss some of his ideas. He observed that historically, kinship institutions in Europe and in China has evolved in different directions, led to different types of institutions. The kinship in Europe, he argued, is based on the Roman law tradition with an emphasis on the contract and legal standing, especially protecting the father's status and power. So in a father-son relationships, the Roman law tradition emphasized the legal protection of patriarchal power in defining family membership, in deciding on family wealth distribution, and which gives rise to the so-called legal system, the rule of law. And this system then extended into other aspects of social life, such as organizational forms. Bureaucracy is one such resulting institutions. As we said, bureaucracy is based on legal rational legitimacy, and it was extended to employment relationships, such as labor contract, and in inter-organizational relationships, such as the legal foundations of stockholding companies, and so on and so forth. But in contrast, as Hamilton argues, the Chinese kinship took very different paths of evolution. For example, in the father-son relationships, the focus was on the son's social role, especially xiao, rather than father's legal rights, which led to, over time, an elaboration of social roles and status positions since between the Ming and the Qing dynasties. And this rule system, once established, then was diffused into other areas through analogies and social imitations, reinforcing the authority relationships in different parts of the society, such as the relationship between mentor and students, relationship between employer and employees, and ultimately the relationship between emperor and his officials. And this led to the central feature of the Chinese culture, what Xiaotong calls the differential mode of association. Now, Xiaotong coined this term, 差序格局, is translated as a differential mode of association to characterize the central feature of the Chinese culture, or social relations in the Chinese culture. And as he argued that social relations in China, like the ripples formed from a stone thrown into a lake. Each circle spread out from the center becomes more distant and at the same time more insignificant. And with this pattern, we are faced with this basic characteristic of the Chinese social structure, or patterns of social relations. And this is another way of expressing the same ideas, but I found it extremely difficult to write it in English. So I just present this as in its own words in Chinese. So if we think about Xiaotong's idea of differential mode of association, it started with the ego at the center, individual at a center, then expand out depending on the distance, social distance of different social groups. So, for example, family becomes the immediate next social circle, the closest, then extend to the kinship, then extend to friends, and ultimately to the outer world of strangers. There's no intimate social relations. And that's the idea behind differential mode of association. So individuals, social groups are treated differently rather than using the same kind of criteria or standards. So social networks or social relations in China should pretty striking contrast with other type of social networks. So if we think about the general network relations in social sciences, for example, the core idea behind social networks has been reciprocity, because the principle of social exchange is central to any social network formations. It's analogous to market relationships. That is to say, every exchange should be reciprocal, either short-term or in the long run, it should be balanced. And the strength of relationships or the forms of relationships should vary depending on the nature of the reciprocity and the cost and benefit associated with it. And so that's why social network research has focused on types of social relations or network ties and strength of ties. But in the Chinese context, in contrast, social relations, of course there are other types of social networks, but a key aspects of Chinese social relations in China tend to be identity-based. That is, based on either blood ties, kinships, or some kind of generalized relationships, generalized kinship relations. Hierarchical, multidimensional dimensions are built into social relations, such as blood ties, of course, and then alums, marriage relations, or hometown origins. And identity-based social relations tend to be stable, robust, and long-term relative to reciprocity-based social relations. So these so-called identity-based social relations provided social and political integrations in the larger Chinese polity. So in the Chinese context, the further question is, what is the relationship between kinship institutions that we just highlighted and state-making processes in history? How social kinship institutions shape bureaucratic practices? And what is interaction between culturally centered kinship institutions and bureaucratic organizations? So these questions lead me to the second aspect of my talk, that is historical dimensions of the state-making processes. And here I want to just focus on two aspects. One is the cultural aspects, that is the family-state isomorphism, so-called 家国同体, 家国一体, or here I use the more organizational concept of 家国同构. And the second aspect is the organizational part, that is the duality in the Chinese bureaucracy. Okay, so family-state isomorphism, so-called 家国同构, has been in the literature for a very long time, so I'm not adding anything new, except just try to re-highlight these things and build connection to my argument about the duality in the Chinese bureaucracy. Historically, especially in a comparative framework, there were always two sources of power in the state-making processes. One is religious, the other one is political. One, or you can say one is mundane, associated with political power. The other one is always spiritual, related to something with morality or with religious power. In Europe, these two types of powers have been separated over historically, and there's a constant tension and struggle between church and the kings. Whereas in China, as we know, that these two powers has long been integrated in the hands of the emperor. So in the Chinese in the Chinese history, the bureaucracy has been developed since the Qing dynasty, if not earlier, as we just said about Shizhou dynasty, so Shizhou era. So the Chinese bureaucracy had long been mature and even overexpanded in terms of formality and structural differentiation. But in terms of capacity, as we use that term today, it is rather limited historically because of technology, the limits in technologies, communication, or otherwise mobilizational, but also the limited capacity in resource extraction and mobilization. So the Chinese state has relied heavily on the cultural or Confucian ideology to integrate the society. And so for a long time, on the one hand, we see very elaborate, formalized bureaucracy. On the other hand, we see that these bureaucracies are rather limited in capacity. So for example, individuals, I'm moving on here, the officials sent into the lower levels stopped at the county level, 军权不下县. But even at the county level, it tends to be what we call, what Xu Tongzhu called one-person government, 一人政府. That is to say, the official was sent to the county to manage whatever the territory it governs, but with very limited personnel power. What is important is the much larger cultural influence that built on Confucian culture. And that becomes a very important part of the forces that integrate Chinese society. But along with the Confucian culture comes the family and the kinship. And so kinship and the state relationship has a long tradition in the state-making processes in China. And so, as we know, that it started, the Chinese so-called 家族制度 or 氏族制度 started in Dongzhou when the emperor delegated his power into these different zhuhou and nobilities and his children and all nobilities. And since then, Chinese culture has evolved around the elaboration of these so-called kinship institutions. At the very beginning, it's only for the very top officials, nobilities, but gradually extended to lower levels of the society. And the emperor was very actively involved in building these kinship organizations. For example, even in the Qing dynasty, the emperor actually explicitly supported so-called seniority-based social structure in villages. That is the very bottom side of the society. And over time, as we know, especially during the Ming and the Qing dynasties, family kinship elaborated and developed at different parts of the country. And here I want to especially point out that Huanan Xuepai, scholars from Hong Kong, from Guangdong, has developed these elaborate studies that discuss the relationship between the emperor's power and kinship, social institutions based on kinship during the Ming and the Qing dynasties. And Helen Xu is one of the major contributors in that Huanan Xuepai, and I have learned so much from reading that literature. So, what we observe here is a coevolution between the family, the kinship on the one side, and the state on the other. So, as we see the so-called father-son relationship specified in the kinship ideologies is a mirror image of the relationship between emperor and officials. And along with this patriarchal society and obedience to authority came to the important part of the state-making processes that formed the relationship between the emperor and officials and between the emperor and its subjects. Now, I want to really reflect on this so-called Confucian ideology. Okay? There are many interpretations. There's a huge debate among scholars. But I found Xueguang, as another historian at Columbia, he discussed Confucianism. His term is Confucian 二元理. There's embedded in Confucian ideology, there's a duality. Okay, duality is similar to what I would argue in the Chinese bureaucracy, that they are both sacred and mundane, both morally on moral high ground, and also at the same time very utilitarian, both symbolistic and instrumental. And in the everyday social life, Confucian ideology gives us connection to social order and status. And that's the formality part. But also, it provides us with a means of pursuing self-interest. And he has very elaborate discussions here, so I'm not going to get into this. But if we think about this dual role of Confucian culture, so if you look at these two pictures here, the one is this is in the Mingguo, that Republican era, when this is a little kid as a patient, and he's bowing to the doctor, show his respect, whereas the doctor, on the other hand, actually bowing back. So here we can clearly see the Confucian ideology provides some kind of social relations and some kind of social order, right? But it is the same Confucian ideology led to the next relationship, the relationship between the emperor and the official. Here you can see the official kneeling to the emperors and reflect the same kind of relationship or same kind of ideological doctrines. So what we can see here is that Confucian ideology, the so-called 两元理, provides both social relations and mundane interaction patterns, as well as high court politics. So what is the importance or implications of this so-called differential mode of association that is embedded in Confucian ideology? Now I want to return to this early picture, this so-called differential mode of association, right? Everybody is at the center of itself and build social relations depending on the distance, the social distance to other social groups. But if we think about it, if this is one individual built a so-called 差序格局 around himself or herself, then another person that is a family member would have his or her own ego and build a 差序格局 around him or herself, right? Then you can imagine that another kinship members also have a similar his or her own 差序格局. Then the friends also will have his or her own 差序格局, right? So what you can see here is the kinship does not produce a similar or integration of all these individuals. Rather, it produces multi-centered relationships in that pattern. And that gives us what I would call the variable coupling among social circles. That is, you can see individuals organize around themselves a social circle, and each individual will have their each individual or each kinship will have their separate social circles. Sometimes these social circles overlap, sometimes they are distant, but somehow they are always connected one way or another. That produces multi-layered social relations, unlike what we think about a centralized system is with only one hierarchy. And that gives us the idea about duality, that is bureaucracy on the one hand, but also horizontal differential mode of association on the other. So the implication here I want to highlight is that the kinship side of the relationship provides multiple dimensions of mode of association. The vertical hierarchy is on the one hand, but horizontal differential mode of association or differential treatment among social groups. Now, these horizontal differentiation give us internal cohesion because social circles, remember, these ego centered social networks has the characteristics that internally they are very cohesive. They belong to the same kinship, but they're also exclusive to outsiders, right? So you can imagine different social circles build their social relations internally cohesive, but externally exclusive. And that gave us this kind of multi-dimensional social networks or social organizations. And this will not just stop at blood tie relations. And we can see there are generalized kinship relations that extend to other areas and extend to broader scope. And for example, it leads to so-called the Confucianization of law and bureaucracy. That is to say, the infusion of different differential mode of association of social relations into other areas, including into the bureaucracy. And this leads us to what I call the duality of hierarchies and patriarchy. And so the key feature of the Chinese bureaucracy is, on the one hand, we do observe a hierarchy just like Weber's bureaucracy. There's a vertical authority across different levels of the organization. On the other hand, we also observed patterns very similar to kinship patriarchy, that is horizontal differential treatments among different social groups within or across the bureaucracies. So what we see here, that these two types of organizations, patriarchy and hierarchy, they have different bases of legitimacy, but they can be compatible within the same Chinese bureaucracy. And that, I think, is something remarkable if you consider different kind of social institutions in other type of organizations across the world. So, okay, this remind me I should hurry up. Okay, so I started with two ideal types, the bureaucracy and kinship. And now I come to a new, I will call it a hybrid form of organizations, and that's the duality in the Chinese bureaucracy. And this actually, Chinese bureaucracy with these duality characteristics are present in different aspects of the Chinese bureaucracy. And that's what I'm going to just highlight briefly to give you some examples that different aspects of the Chinese bureaucracy in history all show this kind of duality characteristics. So I want to start with this Confucianization of law, 法律儒家化, and this is what Xueguang developed. And I want then extend this to the second aspect, that is 组织儒家化, 或者说 organization, Chinese bureaucracy become Confucianized. And I want to give you an example of civil service examination. And I will briefly mention the two-track governance. And hopefully I still have time to wrap up my discussion. Okay, so let's start with Xueguang Zhou's, I think, the insight, observation, that the Confucianization of law. If we think about law, which requires application of the same criteria to all individuals, right? That's the equality before the law, versus Li, the Confucian Li, which really argues for differential treatment of different social groups. And Xueguang Zhou argues that in Chinese context, these two are married together, so-called the Confucianization of law. This is his own words, that the Confucianization of law refers to the practice of the formality of legal rules on appearance, but the infusion of the spirit and criteria of Li, the Confucian criteria, into the legal codes. In other words, changing the standard criteria into differential treatment in legal rules. And I want to give you just one example by the famous writing by Harry. And so the basic idea, I'm not going to translate this whole thing, but the basic idea is that when officials passing judgments in legal civil lawsuit, for example, whenever there's doubts, so there's uncertainty, you always evaluate based on so-called the social roles of individuals. So, for example, between the father and son, if there's dispute, if you cannot decide, you always penalize the son instead of the father. And if the two brothers have disputes, you always penalize the younger brother rather than the older brother. And all these are according to Li, the Chinese Confucian culture. So this is one example how the legal rules are infused with the so-called Confucian social relations or expectation of social relations. And I would argue the same spirit we can find that is from the Confucianization of law into the Confucianization of the bureaucracy. That is to say, there's an infusion of social relations into bureaucratic structure and practice. So on the one hand, bureaucracy has its own formality, vertical rules, formal hierarchies. But on the other hand, we also see that the Confucianization processes, that is identity-based social networks that I discussed before, the different multidimensional social relations based on school origins, cohorts, hometowns, and kinship connections among officials, gentry, and staff. And so this is the kind of Confucianization processes of bureaucracy that shaped the kind of bureaucratic practice now we are now we witnessed in history, but we are now still witnessing today. So let me give you another example about this duality in the Chinese bureaucracy, and that's the civil service examination system, 科举制度. Now, among all the Chinese bureaucratic practice, 科举 probably is closest to what we would call the rational bureaucratic practice. That is to say, civil service examination is merit-based, it's a breakdown of the privileges of the past, and it's very close to selection based on your contribution, your knowledge, and your expertise. But if you look closely at how 科举制度 has been practiced, and quickly we realize we find the shadows of the kinship in this process. Many times the candidates that prepare the examination were supported by kinship resources, and with the expectation that once they become official, they will return the favors to their kinship. And then there are many, many stories associated with this kind of reciprocal relationships and broad tie-based social institutions that supported candidates going through this 科举 examination process. And also, the kinship analogy provided major basis for these officials build their political alliance, so-called 同门, 同年, 同乡. All these are kinship-based, but play a key role in the bureaucratic alliance based on so-called 科举制度. And there are many other aspects also demonstrated this duality, but I think I ran out of time, so I'm not going to discuss this. Let me just list a few things. One is, Fei Xiaotong had this wonderful expression called two-track system, what he called 双轨政治. If you think about how 双轨政治 is formed, it also reflected duality between hierarchy at the upper level, the bureaucratic track, and then kinship or patriarchy in the second part, that is the gentry or kinship track. And the personnel management system in the Chinese bureaucracy, there are many studies had similar things, but I'm not going to get into this. All the staff systems, so-called 幕僚制度. So let me just summarize this part of the duality here. That is, on the one hand, we observe that Chinese bureaucracy is highly formal, with formal structure, rules, procedures, very similar to Iberian bureaucracy. Right? So even 2,000 years apart, they are very similar in formality. But on the other hand, if we look closely, the bureaucracy is in many ways acted like kinships. That is, family tie institution provide the basis for this bureaucratic practice. They are embedded in the different aspects of the bureaucracy, that is, the duality aspects, and they produce huge variations and flexibility and multi-centers in the Chinese bureaucratic system. So the Chinese bureaucracy is not one hierarchy, centralized at the top. Instead, there are many multi-levels, many multi-centers based on kinship, the ego network language called egocentric relationships, multi-centered social networks. And these two different forms, that is hierarchy on the one hand and patriarchy on the other hand, actually are connected in very different ways. And this is the part I have not fully developed my research yet, but I just name a few. One is that they coexist. They are just bonding together, or they are actually connected to each other like welding, what I call hanjie, and sometimes they are intertwined that is very hard to take part one from another. They are practiced simultaneously, and 法律儒家化 have that characteristics. So I will skip this part about why, but I want to really just jump into the final discussion about the potential, the implications for us to understand Chinese modern state today. So I started with my discussion about two types of past dependency. One is the connection between past and present. They help us understand how our present is connected to or come from the past practice. But the second one is that sometimes we do observe historical discontinuity, like in 1949, when the Communist Party took power. There's a major historical turning point that all these previous practice, so-called Confucian practice, has been experienced major change, and new institutions arose after that. But I would argue that these new institutions, in many ways, are a reaction to the historical legacy. So in that sense, we still need to understand this historical legacy to understand why new institutions, is formed and behave in certain ways. And in that context, I talk about this relative comparative framework between European path of state building and the Chinese one. And I argued, I hope I demonstrated enough reasoning and as well as evidence that China embarked on a distinctive state-making process, very different from Europe and probably from other parts of the world. So we have to understand Chinese bureaucracy, the Chinese state-making on its own rights. And this is, I'm just summarizing what I have discussed so far, so let me skip this part and really talk about the kind of implications of state-making in China. Okay. In the literature, we tend to emphasize China as a centralized state in history and how it evolved over time into the present form. But the duality of the Chinese bureaucracy has really pointed out something different. That is to say, the Chinese bureaucracy or the Chinese state in a larger context has uniformity, of course, has centralization features, but also there's embedded diversity within the system. On the one hand, there's the duality part. On the one hand, we see the stable formal hierarchy that provides the basis for uniformity or centralization in the Chinese context. On the other hand, I would argue that patriarchy, and the other side of the duality, also provides sources of diversity and multi-centered institutions in the Chinese culture and in Chinese practice. And that leads us to observe a distinctive path of state-making in China, very different from what we have learned in a European context. Now, if we zoom in to look at 1949, or state building after 1949, I would argue that we observed a new context. In a new context, another tension between this duality, or two sides of the duality. On the one side, the Leninist party organization and ideology actually presented a strong hierarchy, extreme form of hierarchy, with emphasis on discipline and on loyalty. Whereas Confucian culture still persists in the Chinese culture and still reproduced in everyday life in China. And also the Communist Party, consciously or unconsciously, still adopt kinship-like way of organizations. For example, work units. In the Mao era, of course, work units are a major form of organizations, but also revived, I think, to some extent today. In many aspects, I would argue that work units acted like an extended kinship organization. It is cohesive, protective for its members within, and exclusive for others outside of the organizations. And the Confucian culture-based social relationships, the differential treatment of individuals and social groups, we observe, we experience every day, even today. And that, of course, led to the tensions between the two. Right? Leninist party organization emphasized discipline and loyalty, whereas the Chinese culture of the Confucian ideology still breed and reproduce this differential treatment of individuals and social groups, and the practice of governance by the ruling party still adopt the Confucian-based, identity-based social networks. So that, I think, leads us to observe and hopefully explain a set of characteristics in state building in contemporary China in the last how many decades. First, the repeated efforts from the top-down processes try to curb localism, kinship institutions, because these undermines the centralized authority. And there's constant tensions between centralism or central authorities and the local interests, which is based on more or less what I call the kinship organizations or generalized kinship organizations. And that triggered the cycles of centralization and then, when in trouble, decentralization. So in many ways, I would argue that the processes of state building after 1949 is a reaction to historical legacies of the duality of Chinese bureaucracy in the past, but in many ways, these features still continued today. So that, I hope, gave us a chance to reflect on the particular ways that Chinese state-making process has gone through, but also the kind of new issues we're confronting today. So let me end my talk today now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Zhou. Can I invite you to come over?
Sure. Should I put on
this one?
No.
I think he is okay, right? Not to put on the mask. Okay, so, first of all, thank you so much for delivering such a very interesting presentation and talk, and it's a very ambitious project, definitely. Let me introduce myself. I'm Eric Fong, and I'm the convener of the research cluster of the Contemporary China Research at Faculty of Social Sciences, and also the head of the Sociology Department. And we are very happy that we are able to co-organize this event with the Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences. So now I guess all of us will have a lot of questions and comments and suggestions, and would like to discuss with Professor Zhou. So now we open the discussion to the floor. So if you have any question, comments, and please raise your hand, and our colleagues will bring the microphone to you. I'm wondering, do we still have any? Okay, all right. So anyone would like to have or have questions or comments? Oh, am I the only one not wearing mask? David. I follow the law as a sociologist.
So thank you very much, Professor Zhou, for it was just a great overview of both this history and really some important theoretical questions that it arises. And I guess my question is, I was wondering to what extent the kind of the framework that you propose, what is the potential applicability for comparisons beyond China and the West? Because certain things such as kinship modes of organization, and even Xueguang, which can be very much related to, in anthropology, there's Marshall Salin's theory of generalized there's also these concentric circles that lead to generalized reciprocity and more particular forms of reciprocity. So it seems to me that a lot of the things that you're talking about exist all over in the world. So then what is really the specifically Chinese thing here? So you talked about in Europe, the kinship modality was weaker, and so that has implications in Europe. So it sounds like there's something going on over in Europe. But then what you're talking about, you're describing, at least at the kinship modality, it seems to be actually, if we look at other societies and cultures, we have very strong modalities of kinship-based social organization. So it seems then the bureaucracy is where there's a kind of a variable there. But we have many societies that have also had major bureaucracies. So then I'm curious, like what about in various Indian, nations and Southeast Asia, the Ottoman Empire? These are all societies which have strong kinship, presumably, clans and kinship-based organization, but have also had histories of bureaucratic formation. So I'm just curious, like how would that work in those cases?
This is a great question. I myself came across that the same question when I read Salin's many of his collection of articles and also his book, and I came across the same picture when he described this in tribal society. It had nothing to do with China, but it showed very similar differential mode of association that Xueguang. I looked at that, I was really shocked. In a sense, we always think that the Xueguang is the characteristic of Chinese society. It turns out, at least according to Salin's that particular article, that form has been presented in many other tribal societies or other societies. And that raises the fundamental question, certainly to me, what is unique about Chinese society? I was writing, doing a research, not necessarily exploring to outside the world, but really asking this question about what is unique about China at all, which I know a little bit more than other part of culture. And I give some thought to this. So let me just try to form some preliminary ideas on this. Many societies clearly show this pattern of differential mode of association. I think that's not unique to China. So the question is whether what is unique to the Chinese bureaucracy, that is the differential mode of association, penetrated to the Chinese bureaucracy in a way it becomes structured, becomes stabilized, and becomes integral part of the Chinese bureaucracy. That is so different than other bureaucracies we encountered. So for example, let me just give you my thought on this. First of all, I give a list of dualities in the Chinese bureaucracy that shows both the formal hierarchies but also this differential mode of association. And these evidence of that, or elements, some limited evidence of that. If that's the case, I wonder in other part of the bureaucracies, in other part of the world, should similar patterns or not. Now, clearly, from what I have read, I have not encountered other bureaucracies systematically present all these features. So for example, what we call the Confucianization of law and bureaucratic practice. Now, we observe this in China everywhere you go, right? So I study Chinese local governments. Whenever they deliver public goods, addressing public, unrest, whatever thing they call, the differential mode of treatment is so obvious. It's almost like, common phenomena, common practice. But is that the same thing in other parts of the world when the bureaucracy deal with that? So that's one, I think, important empirical question. That is, if on the one hand, at societal level, we observed Patriarchy everywhere. So that's not unique to Chinese. I won't actually argue exactly on that line. But the second question is whether that same Patriarchy, that is what I call patriarchy or patriarchal relationship, somehow embedded in a Chinese bureaucracy in a way that makes it more permanent and distinctive from the typical Iberian type of organizations. So that's, I think, the key question, which I don't have an answer because I'm not familiar with other societies enough to even make that call. But I'm hoping that once we raise these questions, other scholars will study different organizations and different bureaucracies in other countries, and maybe at some point we'll find enough empirical evidence to either reject or accept whatever conclusion we can, base our systematic empirical evidence. I think this is really good. I mean, that's one thing I found I think it's enlightening to realize Patriarchy is not unique to Chinese at all. It is everywhere. I mean, in so-called tribal societies or agrarian societies. So I think this is a really good point.
Yes, there's another one. Professor Chen.
Thank you. Thank you, Xueguang, for coming to Hong Kong U and our institute here for a great talk. Let me follow up on David's point. Maybe one way to think about how we can answer or we can answer David's question is, if you look at the archaeological evidence now, right, for China as well as for Mesopotamia, early on, simple kinship structure was very common. So there were hardly any large enough villages, let alone there were no states and so on until about 6,000 to 5,000 years ago. But as the biological tie-based kinship became initially more hierarchical, okay, so more and more layers would be introduced to make sure that a clan or early kinship organization would not fall apart, rather could actually function. But later on, as intertribal wars and other takeover efforts became successful to bring together different tribes to form early proto-state or chiefdoms, then they would have to go beyond the bloodline, right, to go beyond kinship. So that's how probably in the West, as far as Mesopotamia would go, and also in China, in the Central Plains, then they would have to find a way to establish order by relying on or extending what they were familiar with, that is the bloodline-based kinship structure, all the way to about the 3rd millennium BC, so during the so-called Longshan period, there were a lot of chiefdoms being formed. So that's when they had to establish some bureaucracy in order to govern those chiefdoms, by going beyond the bloodlines. But of course, to make a long story short, so what made China go in a different direction than the Western societies, including Mesopotamia and so on, was later on the introduction of organized churches. Whereas for China, relying on the bloodline kinship as the main cultural resource to establish law and order for much more complicated societies, and that trend, that process has continued all the way until the 20th century and so on. But on the other hand, in the Middle East and the West, with the emergence of the Christian church and then later on Islamic religion, then they had in some ways this way to reorganize societies based on religious orders. Whereas for China, then Confucianism, based on kinship, would be the only resource available because of historical legacy. And anyway, so I thought this may be one way in which, or by which you can address this question raised by David.
Yeah, so what, of course, I think what you said makes a lot of sense. You have written books on, the global history of this financial capitalism, or how they evolved over time. So I think the example you gave about how different regions in the world really evolved over time and how where they departed from each other, and make a lot of sense. I guess what I feel where we needed more attention is how this transition really takes place. So, for example, we know in the early days that kinship played a very important role both in medieval Europe and in China. But why at some point, when the Chinese society still very much reinforced the institution of kinship, whereas European countries, maybe Christian church or maybe some other forces, drive a different kind of path, push into a different path of trajectory of change. So I think these are the details and also the reasoning behind the details. I think these are the things we are still not as sure as we would like to. And I'm hoping that by pushing in one direction, our push now is in focusing on China, but that may actually trigger some other interests to look into the same kind of issue for the other part of the world, so that we have a better understanding and hopefully better theory about this. Yeah, I think these are really great questions.
Xueguang, since you mentioned the Huanan Fang, I would really like to follow up on Zhou's question and also, in a sense, David's question too. One very key institution that we haven't mentioned is the market. Markets, I'm sure, has its own bureaucracy, bureaucratic logic, and I'm sure Zhou would agree, particularly in finance. And during the late imperial periods, in Guangdong, for example, just to make it concrete, David Ford has written quite a bit on the lineage as good business. He's really looking at a form of territorial-based lineages that's not present in the North. The kinship systems in northern China were very much based on genealogical principles, but not backed up by these huge landed estates. Right? And so he was arguing that in the late imperial period, in the absence of commercial law, lineage corporate estates become some of the most effective capital market for economic development. And whatever market bureaucracies that was built up afterwards, corporate-wise. And then you could also see merchant capital in the market towns and in the cities eventually, also building these estates, estates still based on more or less kinship-based principles. And so combining the urban-based merchant estates and the land-based lineage estates in this vast China South, I'm sure, including Jiangnan and all these very commercialized, expanding river deltas. You really have kinship corporations operating as a strong logic for the market. And I just wonder whether you would eventually, in your later research, that you would really sort of explore that angle that would probably, drag Zhou back into this whole situation, far beyond archaeology, but it's really bringing it very relevant ways to the late imperial period, and of course to today too. So, just a note.
Yeah, I agree. And your remark remind me of the danger of talking about China as a whole. And China is so diverse, and with different historical regions in the first place, right? And the market certainly, and even the same what we call market in southern China is somewhat different from the market in western, in innerland, where there's scale types of market hierarchies. So they are very, very different. And there's really a great comments. And I certainly have not paid enough any attention to markets in my research, in my presentation as well. Yeah, so this is really a good, very good sort of reminder to think all the aspects. I just look at mostly focus on state-making processes and focus on more how the bureaucracy has been shaped. So, in a sense, too narrow on the organizational form itself, rather broadly the context. And this is the other thing I think the financial aid contributes so much from our understanding, because it really impacts how the patient institution really interact with the states, and in a sense protecting, borrowing legitimacy from the states, but at the same time enrich their own self-interest together. Family enterprises, community enterprises, all these economic developments. So these are kind of issues I certainly have not given the attention it deserves. And hopefully about future research will extend into these directions.
Thank you.
I'm very intrigued by one of the last points you make on the post-1949 situation. You seem to imply that the 1949 change in state building is something like a break from the past. I think you used the word reaction to political legacy in the past. And then you mentioned a lot, you used the word path dependency a lot, meaning that what we see today has some roots in the past. So what I would like you to say a little bit more is, what is the nature of this reaction to political legacies of the past? Is there a kind of path dependency on that? In relation to that, I think what I would like to know a little bit more is why, when you talk about the origins of Chinese political system, bureaucracy, civic antiquity, you mentioned uniquely Confucianism. Why legalism is totally absent in your story? And so I guess my question is, this reaction to political legacy in the past, is it a brick, or is it really some kind of continuity as well?
Very good question. Well, let me address the last question first. That is, the reason why I focus on Confucianism rather than liberalism is because actually in Chinese liberalism, they are anti-kinship. They basically, it's very much like, everybody just follow the emperor, nothing else. There's no qin, no social relations. But Confucianism really emphasizes the family state isomorphism. So it's the next connection to my way of thinking about duality in the Chinese bureaucracy. So that's the response to the last point. I think I did not make it clear about what I meant by path dependency, especially the connection between before and after 1949. What I want to emphasize is two types of path dependency during this historical conjuncture. The one side is that the Communist Party, I think it's probably the main force movement, is a reaction to the imperial past. It's trying to cut it and build a new society, new country. And so Leninist Party organization has never existed in Chinese history. You cannot find any that form of organization in Chinese history, but it borrowed, adopted, and expanded, and strengthened it. So in that sense, it's really introduced a new form of organization, new way of organizing that's alien to the Chinese past. But because it introduced a new form with ambition of state building and nation building, it ran into counter forces like the Confucian culture, which undermined the central authority of that time. So that's why the basis of legitimacy between this Leninist party and traditional Chinese bureaucracy of the so-called kingship base or patriarchy base is had to have major confrontation, and the everyday operation of the Chinese culture and to undermine the authorities of the centralism of the Leninist party organization. So that's why my point I want to make is that many political campaigns and purges, all these things more or less have something to do with curbing all these factions or the undermining forces that they see as threats. And that has a lot to do with the Chinese past. That's the historical legacy. That's the new institutions, the new state building process or efforts is trying to react to. So that's one sense I say why we need to understand what is the past, how that becomes a threat, undermine the current new institutions, and that's how we observe they react to it in certain ways. So that's one. But I also want to emphasize, but in fact, even the Leninist party, the Communist party, many practice is still adopting the Chinese traditional practice. And Duality is something even today I look at Duality. This is so analogous to a large family is hierarchical, is differential, is different treatment, right? So even individuals are treated in very different way. They are not citizens. Citizens, everybody should have the same relationship with the state, right? But in a Duality, that's not the case. If you are state-owned employees, you are treated differently than your privately owned employees or your private entrepreneurs. You are not treated the same way. Just like in the Confucian culture, there's differential treatment to help individuals and social groups. So in many ways, I think, for whatever reason we can discuss, elaborate, or debate on, the Chinese Communist Party practice in many ways still adopting the traditional Confucian practice. So that's the contradiction, right? That's the tension. On the one hand, they try to react because they undermine the Leninist party's very foundation. On the other hand, they're still practicing that. And so that, I think, creates huge tensions. So once in a while, they have to launch some kind of major campaign to release that tension in one way or another. And so that leads to what I would call the centralization, decentralization cycles. So that's one way to think about the kind of practice we observe since 1949.
So far we have, okay, we have a question here.
Hi, I'm Lawrence Strong from HKUST. Thanks for the interesting talk. I noticed over the course of the talk you consistently referred to China on one hand, Confucian and all that stuff, and then you compare it against, or you use as the sort of reference Weber's ideal type of bureaucracy, which I think he would argue never existed and would never exist, right? So if you actually look at historical examples of British or French or German bureaucracies, they all have strong elements of patriarchy in there. It's not a surprise, for example, that Winston Churchill can trace a history of family service to the government back to the first Duke of Marlborough. I think it's sometimes it's obscured through things like, people will go to Oxbridge and with a certain kind of background and proper breeding and so on and so forth. But, hidden beneath that veneer is that patriarchal, instinct that is inherent in these bureaucratic systems. So wouldn't it be a more fair comparison to look at the actual examples of what was going on in Europe rather than Weber's very, very ideal sort of scenario that is fully rational and frankly probably would never exist?
Yeah, there's a very good point, and a challenge I'm not sure I can meet in the sense that I certainly, these kind of questions I encountered quite a lot. And so why pick Weberian ideal type as a comparison rather than a real organizational form of the practice in another country, another period, whatever. First of all, I think this is a valid critique and argument. On the other hand, because my limited knowledge of other countries or other bureaucracy, it would not be for me to undertake this kind of comparison in that level. Probably not doable. But from what I have read, because my training is mostly after reading the studies of bureaucracy in the U.S. context. From what I read, at least I probably can say this with some confidence that the U.S. bureaucracy operates very differently than the Chinese bureaucracy. If we look at specific issues, for example, public goods provision. Okay, so if we look at policy implementations in certain ways, and if we can isolate decision-making processes in certain ways and see how, let's say, individual social relations play a role or not, to what extent. Okay, and at least it's not based on careful quantitative measures, but at least my impression is that social relations, everywhere you go, it does play a role, as you said, but they are not to the same extent and not playing the same kind of roles. Okay. One way to think about it is I think we probably can do this study like that. Let's trace social relations, network relationships among top leaders in Congress, in Chinese Party Congress versus whatever other Congress we can get hold of. I think we can do that concept. I have not done that yet, but just to address your question you have, I think we could do that. Now, would that change the basic conclusion I try to make? I don't think so, but certainly I think this should be open to empirical verification or falsification. Yeah. So I think that's a very good point.
So far we have questions from our professors. I'm wondering whether any question from our graduate students. Do you have some good studies on whatever other specific bureaucracies we can really look into? I know, for example,
I'm not a sociologist, so it's hard to say.
Yeah, but all scientists have done. The third scholars from the University of Michigan studied street-level bureaucracies in the U.S. context, and we have similar studies in the Chinese context as well. So we can certainly trace that. But the thing is, in China, I have read tons of studies in the Chinese context. They always you can bring in the Chinese, what I discussed about the cultural element easily. Whereas you read in the U.S. context, the case studies, seldom they bring in any cultural aspect. So that's quite a contrast. Yeah.
So any question from our students? Yes, we have a question over there. And then there's a question at the back. The lady can go first, and then we have the question from the back. So you go first.
Oh, sorry. Priority should be given to the student, sorry. I'm just wondering, because you use PRCO 90.9 as a very major watershed, which is of course quite valid, but how about ROC, the 1911 Revolution ROC, which of course testified the downfall of the imperial system, and then a very great experiment of establishing democracy in China, which is very much still continuing in today's Taiwan.
Yeah, That's a good point. Because I'm a sociologist, I have been studying Chinese bureaucracy, contemporary Chinese bureaucracy and state making for so many years. So that's my my focus. So even whenever I look at history, I always keep present China in mind, and that's the ultimate goal. I want to explain what is going on in today's China from historical angle. So that's why. So in a way, I emphasize the connection with after 1949. That I also see the thing is I have not read enough. I'm not sure there's enough material I actually discuss with you. I mean, I can learn from you about this because in a way, it's only 27 years of history, right? Something like that.
That's how you define.
Okay. Yeah, I'm showing my poor knowledge and judgment in this area, so I should stop. Yeah, but the thing is, yes, I have not learned enough about not even paying enough attention. So I'm glad you bring this up. We should discuss. I should get more clues from you. Yeah, thanks.
So we have a question at the back.
Hi, I'm Joel. I'd like to raise a question about you read something in your example part of your PowerPoint. You referred to the 祖宗之法raised by Deng Xiaonan. Yeah, I mean about the imperial ancestor instruction. So we'd like to refer to this example in the paradigm of duality of bureaucracy. I'd like to ask you a question. Because President argued that the practice of the 祖宗之法resulted from two elements. One is the expansion of codicism, and the other one is the racial or ethnic homogeneity. So, about the homogeneity of race or ethnic group, I wonder, in this paragraph, can we say that it's a prerequisite or just a manifestation of the patriarchal aspect?
Could you just elaborate a little bit? I didn't quite get it. You said homogenization of ethnic groups. Did I get it right?
I mean the homogeneity of ethnic groups.
Homogeneity of ethnic groups.
Yes, so I wonder whether it is a prerequisite of the duality or just a manifestation of the patriarchal aspect.
Okay. I did not mention this homogeneity of ethnic groups.
Yeah, I know, but you mentioned the 祖宗之法 example. Yes, so just.
祖宗之法. Oh, maybe we understood Deng Xiaonan in different ways. Oh, Deng Xiaonan book first based on many aspects. But my reading of her book, at least the way the most beneficial to me, is saying that the so-called formal rules have evolved based on intelligentious different interpretations. So that's why she talks about 祖宗之法是可以变的, right? They kind of different interpretations through conflicts. So that's what I focus on. So I did not focus on the aspect you talked about. So I'm not quite sure how that connects to the issues. So could you just elaborate a little bit?
Okay, so let me think how to express. Yeah, I mean about the ethnic homogeneity. I mean,
what is the Chinese word for it? Ethnic homogeneity. What's 中文怎么说?
I mean, okay. 就是说，邓教授的这个观点呢，是基于两个原因，另外一个原因就是五代之宋统治集团这个可以说是种族性趋于统一。那么在这个duality of bureaucracy 这个paradigm 当中，我们是可否将它认为是一种 manifestation 或者是只是一种 prerequisite？
Yeah, okay. Now I got this question. I don't have an answer. The thing is, I'm not familiar with Deng Xiaonan's that line of argument. I probably did not pay attention to her, that part of her book. So I really don't know what she meant by the homogeneity of the ethnic groups. 所以 I have 我不知道怎么 connect to the duality argument. So sorry, I just don't know enough about Deng Nan's argument, even think about the connection between the two.
Okay, I apologize for raising a question on relevant to the topic, sorry.
I just have not read that part. She has a, 主动之法 is one of the well-known, her representative work, this thick, and covered a wide range of issues. So I read it, but only focused on the part that most relevant to what I try to think about my issues. So I did not read that part carefully, so sorry about this.
Any other question? We have a question over there.
Thank you, Professor Zhou. You mentioned the Chinese history of Yili Rufa, the intertwining of law and Confucianism. I wonder, which we can see today in today's China. I wonder what is your view on how does that help or hinder China's modern development of rule of law? Thank you.
Yeah, this is a very good question. Some years back, there's a debate among sociologists in China about so-called Qing Li Fa. That is, Qing is how to translate Fa, of course, as a law or legal standards. Li means reasoning, and Qing means feeling. So I guess in the Chinese culture, all these three should be somewhat interrelated. But but two different individuals have very different. They see different distance how these three should get connected. Okay, and at that time, the major debate is that this is actually a critique of the legalist argument that they emphasize legal standard too much. They didn't care about reasoning, people's feelings about what's right and wrong, and how things should be evaluated. So at that time, there's a critique of the so-called legalist kind of approach to solving social problems. So that's in the, I think, the 80s and 90s. So when you ask whether it's hindrance to, say, China's development or not, I guess this is the main. First of all, I don't think there's one answer. If you look at very specific issues, where we have say, in this case, the enforcement of law is problematic. Actually, it creates it's wrong. It reinforces wrong whatever habit or perception or whatever. But in general, I would argue that China lacks more legality than relative to, say, other countries. Okay, so I think in that sense, strengthening rule of law is important, more important than other aspects. But then after I said this, then I want to add a major footnote that many times in China, legal rules are used as a weapon, a tool, rather than as the foundation of social order. So that's different, and that's so hard to distinguish in everyday life. So that's why you have to qualify a lot before you can say, oh, don't misinterpret what I said, right? But I think China is one major issue. That's the lack rule of law. And the Confucian differential treatment or differential mode of association, to me, certainly has merit in social life in many aspects, but I also have to draw major drawbacks. So that would be my way of thinking about this.
Any other question? Okay, I guess we have already asked many very interesting as well as very important questions. Help us to clarify and understand a little bit more about your project and your thinking. So here I would like to once again thank you so much, Professor Zhou, for presenting such a very stimulating talk with us, and also thank you for answering the question, as well as thank you for all the participants. You all come to this meeting as well as ask a very interesting question. Once again, thank you very much.
Thank you all.